in the past week, I would say. I don't know if you saw this, but the Dutch government, they actually labeled Israel as a national security threat. And this is very interesting because our government has consistently defied orders, for example, to deliver parts to Israel to fight against Palestine. They defied these orders. They were not allowed to do it. They kept doing it. The Netherlands also didn't want to stop delivering military dogs to Israel. They shouldn't have done that, but they kept doing it. And they were constantly saying, they will stand behind Netanyahu no matter what, because one of the political leaders that we have, he's like a big Netanyahu fan. And he has consistently said that he's going to support Netanyahu no matter what. And so that's something that's really interesting. So for now, for the Dutch government to say that Israel is actually a threat to our national security, because I'm Dutch, obviously. I thought that was very interesting. On top of that, Germany now also has said that they think there should be a two-state solution. So they're also slowly backtracking from Israel. And so my point today is the world really stepping away from Israel? And if so, does that really mean anything to us Muslims? Like, are they gonna stop being Islam haters as well? I don't think so. And so that's why I'm live today. I'm live for the first time, by the way, on all these platforms. And I think it's so exciting because I've never done this before, you guys. But okay, I thought it was such an important topic. So I was like, I have to do what I can do to make sure I reach as many people as possible. So, please pray for me. Okay, anyways, we're gonna go to the United States first of all. Okay, I love talking about the United States, but okay, the US, historically speaking, has stood behind Israel. And I want to talk a little bit about why the US has supported Israel, and I think to an extent will always support Israel even if it's not in terms of money. I think in terms of ideology, they will stand behind Israel. And I want to explain to you why. I want to explain why I think that America will always stand behind Israel. The reason I think they will always support Israel in terms of allyship and, even in like the world stage to defend them is because America in itself is Israel. They are a type of Israel. They've been a type of Israel. And what do I mean by that? I mean that America is built on stolen land, okay? Let's just make that clear. Let's just go back a few centuries ago, like 5-6 centuries. America was built on the blood of the natives, okay? They stole their homes, they occupied their lands, and they pretended like these people were so uncivilized that they needed these Europeans to come to take them all out and build a new country, okay? Does that sound familiar? I think it does, because that's exactly what Israel's been doing in the past few decades. And so even if you would say, okay, America is gonna not anymore support Israel in terms of money, when it comes to ideology, these two are like twins, okay? And that's not gonna change, because in the end, Americans are, as we speak, living on stolen land. I'm so sorry, I cannot make it sound better, but they're living on stolen land right now. And so historically speaking, what Israel is doing right now is what America has been doing for centuries, okay? So that's a thing that I think you need to keep in mind. Another thing I think you need to keep in mind is that when you steal land, like the US has stolen land from the natives, you're always gonna have this type of concern that whoever comes in is gonna do exactly the same that you've been doing, right? And so America's, distrust of immigrants and distrust of Muslims, it comes from the fact that they once went there, betrayed the natives, built land on the backs of these people, and just stole everything, right? And so that's why nowadays they're still having this attitude of, we came here, we stole everything, and this land is never going to belong to them. And that's exactly what Israel's been doing and what they're doing right now. And so that also brings me to another point, which I think is a little bit interesting. I'm just going to take a look at if this is well done. I think this works like this. Okay, yeah, so that brings me to another point, and that is, where do these Americans come from? Okay, and so that goes back obviously to Europe, because Europeans once went to North and South America to occupy the land over there. And if you understand where they come from, you also understand why Europe and the US have a similar attitude right now towards Israel. Okay, and not just Europe and the US, it's about Europe, the US, Israel, because they're kind of all the same people. Okay, and I'm gonna get to that. Okay, so Germany as we know it right now, but also the north of Europe, those are people who come from the Germanic tribes, okay? And so the Germanic tribes were once where we know Germany is now, and the Germanic tribes, they went up north, they went to Scandinavia, they went to what we know now as UK, and they basically drove out the native people there. That's something they did in the UK. What we now know as UK, they drove out the Scottish people, the Irish people. In Scandinavia, they drove out these natives, which I think are called Inuit over there, but they drove them out and occupied the lands, okay? And then so once they started also gaining more knowledge about sailing, these people also went over to the US to start doing the same over there. And that should already give you an idea. Here, that you maybe hear me better, because I'm not sure if you guys on TikTok can hear me well, but I think this should go a little bit better. Okay, so anyways, what I was saying is that should give you a little bit of an idea about what the attitude is of these people, right? So they've done it in Europe, they've done it then in the US, and they are doing it right now also in Israel. But one thing that I think is really important to know, and I've spoken about this before when I spoke about Germany, is that Germany particularly has a religion of paganism, which also promotes this attitude of destruction. And I know this sounds pretty heavy, but I can explain it. And I'm going to explain it by using a book written by Dr. Abdullah Hakim Quick. He sent it to me, his son sent it to me so I could read about it. And it's about pagan holidays, and it's mostly about how these pagan holidays are very, opposite of us Muslims, what we celebrate and what we worship. And basically, these pagan holidays, these are usually worshiping gods, and it's a bit shocking if you hear it, but they worship gods of war, of materialism, of promiscuity, behaving in a way that's a bit outlandish. And it's like, what we would say, it doesn't honor women, or it doesn't honor bodies of women. That's the type of holidays they would have. Consumerism, but a lot of violence was involved in these pagan holidays. And so the thing that I think is really important for Muslims to know, and for anyone to know who wants to understand why people are the way they are in Europe, but also in the Americas, and I'm talking about, these colonizers, is because they come from a religion that actually promotes and advocates worshiping gods of war. I'm going to give you some examples to make this more concrete, because this might sound a little bit like, okay, well, maybe you're just really Muslim and you just don't like these holidays. But I'm going to give you specific examples, because these examples are written about in this book. And so this book is really good. If you don't have it yet, I would advise you to get it by Dr. Abdullah Hakim Quick. So he talks, for example, about Christianity having Christmas, right? And he talks about how in Christianity, Christmas is celebrated as the birthday of Isa alayhi salam, Jesus Christ, right? But that his birthday was actually not in December, and a lot of Christians also know this. They know that Isa alayhi salam was not born in December, but if you look at this Germanic pagan religion, they do have celebrations on the 25th of December, which are about let's see, it's about this god also who I think was symbolizing demoralization, destruction. And then you have also the Christmas tree, which was also something that the Scandinavian Germanic people did. They worshipped trees. And then you have this entire thing of gift giving, which is also something from the pagans. And the gifts usually represent also sacrifices. So the gifts used to be dolls, and those were like sacrifices of, you know, the children to these gods. And so this is just one example of these holidays, which are pagan holidays, which entered Christianity and which are now still being celebrated, which should show you that this pagan religion of the Germanic people is being continued as we speak now. Another example, which I think is really important, is celebrating Sunday as the day of rest. Because the pagan people also celebrated on Sunday because they would worship their god of war, and his name was Mitra. And so in order to worship their god of war, the pagans would take off on Sunday, and they included that nowadays in Christianity. And nowadays you can see in Europe and the US, they have continued these trends. And in this book by Dr. Abdullah Hakim Quick, he talks about these trends. He talks about these holidays being celebrated as we speak. Like, this is not something that ended when Christianity started. Not at all. This is something that's continuing as we speak. They are still worshiping these gods of war. And that should explain something to you about why the world is as it is. When they are still worshiping these gods of war in Europe and in the US, what do you think is going to happen? How do you think they're going to behave? Well, anyways, if you read the book, you'll see that almost every holiday that exists has a link to this pagan type of religion. And, you know, it's not a religion of peace. It's definitely not a religion of being good to each other. It's a religion that's quite violent and promotes a lot of things that we as Muslims absolutely cannot associate with. Yet, many Muslims celebrate these pagan holidays. And I think that is unacceptable, guys. I think it's unacceptable. Okay, anyways, then I want to talk about another thing, and which is the banking families of Germany who migrated at some point to the US. And the reason why I want to mention this, the reason why I think it's really important to mention this, I'm so sorry if I think it's better like this. The reason why I want to mention this is because it makes sense why there's still so much war right now if you take into account that some of these very prominent families who used to live in Germany at some point migrated to the US. Some of them stayed behind, some of these banking families, some of them stayed there. Their religion, I've already explained to you, it has a lot to do with war. It has a lot to do with sacrifices. It has a lot to do with demoralization. And so what you see then, this is like, let's say around the First World War. There's one specific story that illustrates really well what I'm about to say. So that's the story of the Warburg brothers, okay? If you know anything about the important banking families in the US, you know these families as well. You don't recognize. And so these families are called the Rothschilds, the Rockefellers, but also the Warburg brothers. Okay, and so the Warburg brothers specifically, let me tell you a little bit about them. The Warburg brothers, they were spread it out over the US and Germany. And so I'm going to tell you exactly who stayed where. So Max Warburg was the banker on the German side during the World War I. And then you had Paul Warburg, who was the brother who was in the US. So this banking family, one controlled the US central bank, the Federal Reserve. The other one controlled the bank in Germany. What did they do? There was a war going on. Both the brothers were funding one side of the war. One was funding the US. The other one was funding Germany. Why? Why would they do that? Well, by funding these countries, but as a bank, as a private bank, or as the Federal Reserve, they would give them money so they could continue fighting each other. So that's what happened during World War I with these two brothers specifically. But as you know now, even nowadays, when it comes to a lot of these conflicts, you'll see that, the US or these institutes related to the US or these banking families or these secret services are oftentimes linked to both parts of a conflict. So they're not just funding one part of the conflict, they're funding both parts of the conflict. And this shows how, these people who have their origins in Germany, who have a lot of influence, who have a lot of money, their goal is not necessarily to help one side of a conflict or to help one ideology in the world. The goal is oftentimes to keep the war, to continue the war as long as possible, because in the end, it's a matter of sacrifice, but it's also a matter of making sure that these countries earn money, or these banks earn money by lending money to the government, which they then spend, on this war, and that keeps going, as long as the war keeps going. And so a lot of people, they wonder, how is it possible that these wars just keep going on and on and on? Every time we think we have a solution, all of a sudden, something new happens and these wars just extend. Well, this is one of the reasons why. This is one of the reasons why you could look at it and be like, maybe there's another incentive for people to continue these wars. And I think this is a very realistic one to look at, especially if you take into account, for example, in the Israel conflict, in the occupation of Gaza and Palestine, the Rothschilds specifically, this banking family from Germany, was super involved from day one. Like the Balfour Declaration was addressed to the Rothschilds, right? It was addressed to Lionel Walter Rothschild. And so when people wonder, what is their, what's their part in this conflict specifically? Well, they actually helped this conflict start. And so that also makes a great case for why there's definitely a reason to believe that these conflicts are started, and then the banks are the ones who benefit because it was started by a banking family specifically. So I think that's really important to take into account. Okay, so what we've already been through. So the US is starting to turn on Israel. Some European nations are starting to turn on Israel as well. We look back to the historical, activities of the US. They're kind of aligned with what's happening in Israel. We look back at the religion, the origins of the religion of many Americans and Europeans, and they promote violent behavior as well. And we looked at the economic incentive for all these countries to continue to fight each other. And so there seems to be an incentive there as well to continue to fight, because it's just going to make these banking families more rich. Okay, that's the first thing I want to tell you about. But then another thing which I think is really important is that Americans right now, and I would say Europeans kind of fall into the same category, but Americans right now, even though they're waking up to Israel being a leech, it's literally a leech sucking them dry, getting billions and billions and billions of dollars, even though America is not doing well at all. Americans are waking up, and I think, mashallah, that's amazing, Amazing, guys. Congratulations. But I think one thing that's really important to take into account is that even though Americans know more than $300 billion has been given to Israel, which could have helped them, they've also received decades of brainwashing and grooming, which makes them still very averse against Muslims. Okay, so you would expect, they're starting to see Israel is not their friend. They're not benefiting at all from this relationship. A lot of these politicians are like, hey, you know what? We need to back off from this friendship. Okay, that's great. But what you see is that that doesn't change their perspective, particularly on Islam. And that has everything to do with the fact that they've been brainwashed for many decades, I would say. Okay, and another thing which I think is really important is that Americans, the way they are kept right now is in a state of survival. And I think a lot of people underestimate that. The US seriously is a third world country. Okay, like that's not, like, I'm not exaggerating. The US is a third world country. I'm gonna explain to you why. For example, the US has a literacy rate of 80%, right? That shows me that they're deliberately being kept dumb. Like, that's not by accident that you have a literacy rate of 80% when, for example, Palestinians themselves almost have a literacy rate of 100%. Like, being treated the way they are under occupation, Palestinians themselves have one of the highest literacy rates in the world. While the US, supposedly the leader of the world, of the free world, has literacy rates of around 80%. Isn't that crazy? Doesn't that tell you something about how they are keeping Americans, I mean, I don't know how else to say it, but a little bit dumb so that they cannot really understand what's going on? That's one thing I just want to point out. Like, Americans are not deliberately being educated so they can be like strategic and critical minds. They're being kept in a state of, I would say, deprivation. Take the mic from the talking towel. Okay, well, so the mic, I think, thank you so much for the heads up, because the mic wasn't in the right place. Okay, so anyway, so that's number one. Another reason why I would say that Americans are kept in a state of survival is the following. In the US, every 40 seconds, a child goes missing. Like, I don't know if you know this, but this country is not at all friendly to its people. Like, its people, its children are not at all safe. And so that's another thing. Then we have 25% of Americans, they cannot get medical help because they don't have healthcare for it. And that should show you like how deprived, once again, Americans are to not even be able to take care of themselves because they simply don't have the money. Another thing which I think is very noteworthy, 10% of American girls is on OnlyFans, selling her body actively so she can, earn a living, so she can stay alive. And like, this is another one of those things that shows Americans are in a state of survival, I would say. They're not thriving. They don't have the time to do the research and find out, hey, are Muslims actually my enemy? I don't think they can do that, because how can they do that when they hardly have time to rest, to relax, to educate themselves? And so that is one I think is really concerning. Another thing that I think is really concerning is that the owner of OnlyFans is, by the way, Israeli. Another thing that's really noteworthy is that the owner of Pornhub is also Israeli. And, in the US, there's a huge issue with men being demotivated because they don't have, the motivation, the energy to really go out and work and thrive. And this is something they say is partially caused by things like overexposure to the flesh, to porn, for example. And so these are all things that should give you an idea that, Americans are not thriving right now. They're the ones who are surviving, and it's very hard for them to also, be able to think critically about, for example, Islam and the role Islam plays in the world, and that it's not their enemy. Anyways, I can see that some of my viewers are not too happy about me saying that, and that's what it is. It is what it is. But this isn't the only reason why Americans are very anti-Islam, and I'm gonna give you some other ideas about the tools that the US is using to make Americans focus on Islam as their enemy, okay? Because I would say when we talk about Islam hate in the US, it's not just about, okay, well, Americans are not surviving and that's why they cannot think straight. No, it's also about Americans actively being groomed to dislike Muslims. And I'm going to tell you some of the tools that are being used to make Americans turn against Muslims, okay? first one I would say straight up propaganda. There's straight up propaganda of organizations. For example, Act for America. That's one of these organizations who, speak very negatively about Islam, and they really try to rile people up to view Muslims as a threat to society, as a threat to America. And, they also try to give people ideas about how they can fight the rise of Muslims in the US. That's one thing. So straight up propaganda. Al Jazeera actually published an article on this because they intercepted one of their internal documents which described how Americans should go about the rise of Islam in the US. I'm going to tell you what was in this document, okay? So one of the things that was mentioned that American parents should already start monitoring classes in kindergarten to find out what the teachers were saying. If they were saying something about Islam, then these American parents need to kind of like intervene and make sure that these parents or these teachers are gonna get, like negative consequences for that, which is like weird. I don't know which Muslims are deliberately like infiltrating kindergartens just to spread Islam. It's just crazy. It's just wild. Okay, then another thing which was in the document is that they said that departments in university that had a lot of likelihood of being funded by Saudis, and they would talk about these departments, I think it was political science and Middle Eastern studies. And so they would say, these are anti-Israel, anti-America, departments, organizations. And I think that's also so wild because the thing is, if you look at a lot of these pro-Palestine professors, it is usually people who studied history or political science. And I'm not saying that these are specifically like Muslims or Palestinian professors. That's not the case at all. These are oftentimes just American citizens who are professors in these topics. But because they're very educated in, for example, Middle Eastern studies or Islam, they are also more likely. I'm just gonna put my phone on non-disturb because so these people are more likely to also they know the history of Palestine. These type of professors, they often advocate for Palestinians and for Middle Eastern countries because they usually admit America's going in there, they're basically taking millions of people out. Then everything they said they were looking for is not there, and it's just not right, And so that's what this organization, Act for America, also says. They said, in these departments, these people are super anti-America, and they're super pro-anti-Israel. But it's like, no, they're not. They're just educated people, and they know that these countries like the Middle East or Palestine, they're not the problem. I mean, America going everywhere, trying to seize everything, stealing land, stealing homes, that's the problem. And so that's really interesting, I thought, when I read it in this article by AJ, because they're right. These type of organizations, they're gonna be against American, this nationalistic American idea that they need to go everywhere, spread democracy or pro-Israel organizations. They're gonna be against it. And so another thing they say is that there's a growth of madrasas, like Islamic schools across the United States. That's so funny to me. But okay. This is something that I think, Americans, they really need to not focus on that. I mean, I was looking up stats, for example, for teen pregnancy in the US, like 3 in 10 teens in America. So 3 out of 10 American teenage girls will get pregnant at least once before the age of 20, which is about 750,000 teen pregnancies per year. Another thing, every year, let's see. So another thing which I thought was really concerning is that 46.3 million people in the United States has had a substance addiction, which is insane. 46 million people. Another thing, 5 million of Americans meet the criteria for compulsive gambling. I mean, these are the problems America has. Like, it's not Muslim schools. It's not departments in university who teach on the Middle East. It's these problems the US has. And then they're like trying to spread this fear for Sharia. You know, they're everywhere like, oh, Sharia is taking over. Sharia is taking over. I wish for you that Sharia was taking over, because then you wouldn't have these gambling issues. You wouldn't have these substance abuse issues, because it wouldn't be allowed. You wouldn't have women, 10% of American women selling their body on OnlyFans. Like 10% of 18-year-olds until 24-year-olds in the US are selling pictures of their naked body on the internet. Like, how is that normal? And like, I just want to mention one thing, like Sharia law is not something that, you know, everybody collectively agrees on and then you follow that. Sharia law is something that Muslims individually choose to follow, because they don't want to live this life of drug abuse and selling your children online and having teen pregnancies. They don't want that, so they don't do that. And so millions, if not billions of Muslims around the world, they choose to implement Sharia in their lives without the government telling them. It's just something they believe in. And so for the US, you know, for these organizations like, what is it called again? Act for America, to warn Americans against Sharia when they struggle so much with all these issues of addiction, gambling, teenage pregnancies, OnlyFans. It's insane. You know, it's insane. And it also shows how, you know, ignorant most Americans are, because when you hear them speak about Sharia, it's like it's the devil to them. But it's actually something that would take away all the issues they have right now. Okay, but okay, that's one thing. Okay, that's the straight up propaganda in the US. Then I want to go to the next point, which is the education system in the US. I mean, that's also been hijacked. I just want you to know that, like, Americans not being able to think for themselves is because Americans were groomed by their government and educational system to not be able to think for themselves. Why do I say that? Well, I don't know if you know this, but the Rockefeller family is the one who funded a lot of the education curriculum in the US. Like, a lot of the books have been audited, assessed by this family, this German banking family, who, you know, is said to want to create, obviously, factory workers, not independent thinkers. They are the ones behind the American education system. And then people wonder why 80% of Americans is literate versus, for example, Palestine, who almost has 100%. You wonder about that, right? You wonder why Americans are like so focused on Islam when these books obviously are written in the benefit of these ruling families who, you know, have interest in certain things like wars, you know. So that's one thing I wanted to also mention to you. This is something I researched a lot because, for example, in the Ottoman Empire, I was very interested in knowing when the Rockefeller family, or if ever the Rockefeller family had influence in what the people would learn, and if that correlated to the Ottoman Empire falling. But okay, I couldn't find it in that sense, but I could find it in the US. In the US, it's a given. In agriculture, in medicine, in elite organizations like schools, but also rural schools, this family has, you know, invested hundreds of millions of dollars since the beginning of the 20th century. And so, I mean, that says a lot. I would never, as a country, let a commercial family have so much say in the education system of my country. I would never do that, because you just set yourself up for creating people who will do everything this family wants them to do, like everything in their benefit. It just doesn't make sense. But okay, anyways, you know, to each their own. Okay, then we have another thing which I think is really interesting to mention is the books which are used in schools, American schools. I've obviously read books in American schooling system throughout, like, let's say the past century, because I always want to know if certain information about Islam is available at one point and then unavailable at a later point. And I've seen that happen, by the way. I've seen it happen that certain empires, Muslim empires, were, for example, mentioned in the 19th century in the books that were used in schooling in America in the 19th century. But then in the 20th century, these names, these empires would completely be erased. Okay, so I've seen that. And I think what's really interesting is one of these publishers is Pergamon Press. I think Pergamon Press or Pergamon Publisher. And that was the press owned by the father of Ghislaine Maxwell, right? I think his name was Robert Maxwell from the Epstein case. So this person who was very well regarded in Israeli society, right? Who was buried in like the most sacred place in Israel. And people are saying he was an asset to Mossad. He was publishing books for American children to learn about in school. If that doesn't tell you how compromised American education is, I don't know what will. And so this is something I don't know. I thought this is crazy. You know, when I was like putting it all together, I was like, it makes so much sense that Americans are so laser focused on repeating the same thing over and over and over and over again, which is that Muslims are their enemies, right? Muslims, Islam is the enemy of America. And then you look at where these Americans are trained, how they are educated, and then you look at all these things and it's like, it totally makes sense. Okay. Anyways, that's the education, but then I would say academia, which I always like to mention. Academia is also at some point obviously compromised. And I would say, you know, Act for America Now, they already said it, like these organizations, like these departments and universities, they are very pro-Palestine, they're very pro the Middle East, because obviously they have that information. But that doesn't mean there haven't been attempts to also hijack this part of society, because it's a very important part of society, right? It's where people get educated to rule countries. It's where people get educated to rule big companies. And so in academia, one thing I find very noteworthy, I once watched a part of a lecture by David Miller, and he's a professor from the UK. I think he's from the UK or the US, I don't know, but he works at a university in the UK. And he's the world's leading academic expert on Islamophobia. And you obviously want to hear this. And in a lecture, he spoke about the origins of Islam hate, and he traces it back to the brother of Netanyahu. He literally traces it back to the brother of Netanyahu. He said that the brother of Netanyahu, he ran this institute called the Jonathan Institute, which was the first time they had this conference in 1984. And in this conference, they dropped this idea of Islamic terrorism for the first time. And that's where it started growing. And I've mentioned this before in my lecture, in my podcast as well. Netanyahu was also the one who predicted 9/11, right? Like he said it very randomly. I think it was 1989 in an interview. He was like, well, if we don't stop the Muslims now, they might try to attack the Twin Towers. And like, that was just a wild thing to predict. Like, that's crazy. Nobody predicts that. That was it. Like that seems planned, obviously. Like, who predicts something like that? Anyways, these researchers, you know, done by these imperialists who then come up with this construction trying to criminate, someone or something. It's just corruption. It's just pure corruption. But it does explain why an entire country of people is brainwashed to believe a certain thing. That's something that I think is very clear. Okay, well, after having only criticized everything but not given a solution, I obviously don't want to leave you like that. I also want to talk a little bit about a solution for example, how to look at the solution for Gaza, for example. It's clear to me that we cannot rely on Europe or the US to actually make an attempt to save the Palestinian people. I do not believe that. You know, if you look at their history of occupying everything and always taking out natives without any shame, why do we think they will ever stick up for Palestinians? Like, that's not at all something that we need to expect from them. I think one solution for this huge problem in the Muslim world, this huge pain and this huge, it's a tragedy that's currently unfolding in the Muslim world, is for us to look for the solutions within ourselves and not to look at, when is Trump going to speak out for Palestine? When is NATO going to speak out for Palestine? When is UN going to speak out for Palestine? In the Quran, it's been said, we don't have to look for allies in people who are not Muslims. We should look for our allies, for our friends, for our people to protect us in the Muslim world. And these are, I think it's a hadith, and it's a hadith, right? Which says that, what is it called? Awliya, protectors and helpers. That we shouldn't look for them outside of the Muslim world. I agree with that, because if you look even at this situation with Israel, they might turn their back on Israel, but they're not gonna all of a sudden be welcoming to Muslims. I don't believe that at all. And so there's been no solution right now for Gaza. We have to just be honest, there's no solution. But one thing that has been mentioned in the past week was during a meeting in New York, and it was mentioned that some of the Arab nations were willing to take over the power in Gaza just so that the Palestinians, the Gazans, the actual people could be safe. But this would mean that Hamas would have to disarm. And they would then transfer this power to another political party inside Gaza, and that would be their solution. But one thing that I think Muslims know this, but a lot of non-Muslims don't know, that in the Muslim world, there's also a huge divide, unfortunately, between Arab nations, and then there is this, I think it's called the Axis of Resistance, which consists of Iran, some groups in Lebanon, the Yemeni Houthis, and some Syrian groups. And these are two parts that often are, facing each other in opposite directions. And so these are not usually groups who work together. But one thing that I think is really important, that in this instance, we don't try to look at, the other one is wrong, this person can do it better, this country can do it better. We need to look for a solution for the Palestinians, for Gaza. And in this situation, I do think that it would be helpful for Hamas to transfer their power to these Arab nations, because at this point, we need to think about the people of Gaza. One thing that I talked about in my last episode is that Israel is not fighting Hamas. That's something we've established. They're fighting children. It's an infanticide. They're fighting children. They're also fighting women. It's been said by a special rapporteur in UN that they're targeting specifically women. It's called a femigenocide. On top of that, they're also targeting the medical professions. It's a medicide, right? They're trying to take out as many medical professions in Gaza as possible. It's a scholasticide. They're trying to take out all these academic intellectuals so that Gaza will have trouble, governing itself, just producing people who have PhDs, master's degrees, because Israel is specifically targeting them. It's a genocide. They're also specifically targeting journalists. And so all of these terms, which I discussed during my last podcast, also show that Israel is not fighting Hamas. They're clearly not fighting Hamas. And so Hamas obviously has done something that's very impressive. Nowadays, almost everyone knows about Palestine and Gaza. Even in my environment, I study political science, obviously in the past 10 years, everyone I know and my friends, we all knew about Gaza. We all knew about Palestine. We always advocated for Palestine. But most people around us in Europe, they didn't know and they didn't care. They didn't care about this. You would really have to be in these circles to know about Palestine. But that's no longer the case. And that's definitely something that I guess Hamas has made it happen in a way that this did get a lot of attention. I don't know if I necessarily supported that so many Palestinians died. These are people that are, children, women, innocent people who died. But regardless, this conflict has changed for the rest of the time. Like, this will never be the way it was 10 years ago when it was just people in universities studying the subject, like my friends were, who were writing PhDs, who were writing their thesis on it. It will never be like that again. However, we also are at a point where it doesn't seem like there's going to be a positive outcome. The next step that Netanyahu is preparing is that he wants to put all the Gazans in a concentration camp, which he calls a humanitarian city, which it's definitely not going to be. A humanitarian city would mean that people could go in and out. They're definitely not going to let them go in and out. Second, they're not going to give them some dignified life, like accommodation or anything. They're going to put them in tents, if they even put them in tents. And so I would say that the next step, honestly, it frightens me so much. And I think that we really need to speak about something radically changing, and it not being waiting for Trump to say something or waiting for NATO or the European Union to say something. I think it needs to come from the Muslim world itself. I mean, obviously, there's also the opportunity for, this other alliance from Iran and Hezbollah to come up with a proposal, but I don't think they've done that. And so the proposal that's on the table right now is that Hamas would disarm and that they would actually transfer power to the Arab nations, to some of the Arab nations. I think that this is a solution that we need to push, and I think it's for the people of Gaza, it's for the women, it's for the children, it's for the medical professions, the journalists, the intellectuals who are being targeted, because this is not a fight between Hamas and Israel. Like I said, I think this is a fight between Israel and making sure that Gaza will never be able to bounce back. And so that's my final message of today. I mean, we talked about all of these different players in this very painful tragedy that's unfolding in the Muslim world, and we need to solve that. We definitely need to not think that the US or Europe is all of a sudden gonna grow like a soft heart for Muslims and try to save them. I think that's something that we have enough evidence for to conclude. Okay, anyways, guys, that's it for today. This was my first live. I hope you enjoyed it, and make sure to share with people you think could benefit from this. Please make sure to also share your ideas about what you think a solution could be for Gaza. Now that you know, so many people are dying, what the next steps are for Gaza, what Netanyahu wants for them, the humanitarian camps, the concentration camps. And let's start a discussion on this, because the change needs to come. I do not want my friends in Gaza to have to move to a concentration camp in the next week. I would rather have for Hamas to leave power, for them to peacefully leave Gaza if they can, because I do think they can travel back and forth out of Gaza if they want, for them to leave Gaza, for maybe there be some type of protection for them. I don't know how that would work, because I believe that in the end, the goal of these Arab nations is not to destroy Hamas. I think it is just to make sure that the Gazans continue to live. So definitely share your idea with me. I'm very curious to hear how you think this should go, and let's keep the conversation going. Thank you so much, everyone.